Air raids were so frequent, with the British by night and the Americans by day, that Berliners felt that they spent more time in cellars and air raid shelters than in their own beds. The lack of sleep contributed to the strange mixture of suppressed hysteria and fatalism. Far fewer people seemed to worry about being denounced to the Gestapo for defeatism, as the rash of jokes indicated. The ubiquitous initials LSR for Luftschutzraum, or air raid shelter, were said to stand for Lernt schnell Russisch, learn Russian quickly. Most Berliners had entirely dropped the Heil Hitler greeting. When Lothar Löhe, a Hitler youth who had been away from the city, used it on entering a shop, everyone turned and stared at him. It was the last time he uttered the words when not on duty. Löhe found that the most common greeting had become Bleib übrig, survive. The humour also reflected the grotesque, sometimes surreal images of the time. The largest air raid construction in Berlin was the Zoo bunker, a vast ferro-concrete fortress of the totalitarian age, with flak batteries on the roof and huge shelters below, into which crowds of Berliners packed when the sirens sounded. The diarist Ursula von Kardorff described it as like a stage set for the prison scene in Fidelio. Meanwhile, loving couples embraced on concrete spiral staircases, as if taking part in a travesty of a fancy dress ball. There was a pervasive atmosphere of impending downfall in personal lives as much as in the nation's existence. People spent their money recklessly, half assuming that it would soon be worthless. And there were stories, although hard to confirm, of girls and young women coupling with strangers in dark corners around the zoo station and in the Tiergarten. The desire to dispense with innocence is said to have become even more desperate later, as the Red Army approached Berlin. The air raid shelters themselves, lit with blue lights, could indeed provide a foretaste of claustrophobic hell, as people pushed in, bundled in their warmest clothes and carrying small cardboard suitcases containing sandwiches and thermos. In theory, all basic needs were catered for in the shelters. There was a Sanitätsraum with a nurse, where women could go into labour. Childbirth seemed to be accelerated by the vibrations from bomb explosions, which felt as if they came as much from the centre of the earth as from ground level. The ceilings were painted with luminous paint for the frequent occasions during the air raids when the lights failed, first dimming, then flickering off. Water supplies ceased when mains were hit, and the aborte, or lavatories, soon became disgusting, a real distress for a nation preoccupied with hygiene. Often the lavatories were sealed off by the authorities, because there were so many cases of depressed people who, having locked the door, committed suicide. For a population of around 3 million, Berlin did not have enough shelters, so they were usually overcrowded. In the main corridors, seating halls and bunk rooms, the air was foul from overuse, and condensation dripped from the ceilings. The complex of shelters under the Gesundbrunnen U-Bahn station had been designed to take 1,500 people, yet often more than 3 times that number packed in. Candles were used to measure the diminishing levels of oxygen. When a candle placed on the floor went out, children were picked up and held at shoulder height. When a candle on a chair went out, then the evacuation of the level began. And if a third candle, positioned at about chin level, began to sputter, then the whole bunker was evacuated, however heavy the attack above. The foreign workers in Berlin, 300,000, strong and identifiable by a letter painted on their clothes to denote their country of origin, were simply forbidden entry to underground bunkers and cellars. This was partly an extension of the Nazi policy to stop them mingling intimately with the German race, but the overriding concern of the authorities was to save the lives of Germans. A forced labourer, particularly an Ostarbeiter, or Eastern worker, most of whom had been rounded up in the Ukraine and Belorussia, was regarded as expendable. Yet many foreign workers, conscripted as well as volunteers, enjoyed a far greater degree of freedom than the unfortunates consigned to camps. Those who worked in armaments factories around the capital, for example, had created their own refuge and bohemian subculture, with news sheets and plays in the depths of the Friedrichstrasse station. Their spirits were rising visibly as the Red Army advanced, while those of their exploiters fell. Most Germans looked on foreign workers with trepidation. They saw them as a Trojan horse garrison, ready to attack and revenge themselves as soon as the enemy armies approached the city. Berliners suffered from an atavistic and visceral fear of the Slav invader from the east. Fear was easily turned to hate. As the Red Army approached, Goebbels's propaganda harked on again and again about the atrocities at Nemmersdorf, when Red Army troops had invaded the southeastern corner of East Prussia the previous autumn and raped and murdered inhabitants of this village. Some people had their own reasons for refusing to take shelter during a bombing raid. A married man who used to visit his mistress regularly in the district of Prenzlauer Berg could not go down to the communal cellar because that would have aroused suspicions. One evening the building received a direct hit, and the luckless adulterer who had been sitting on a sofa was buried up to his neck in rubble. After the raid, a boy called Erich Schmidtke and a Czech labourer whose illegal presence in the cellar had been tolerated heard his screams of pain and ran upstairs towards the sound. After he had been dug out and carried off for treatment, the 14-year-old Erich then had to go to tell the injured man's wife that her husband had been badly injured in this other woman's flat. She started screaming in anger. The fact that he had been with this woman agitated her far more than his fate. Children in those times received a harsh introduction to the realities of the adult world. General Günther Blumentritt, like most of those in authority, was convinced that the bombing raids on Germany produced a real Volksgenossenschaft, or patriotic comradeship. This may well have been true in 1942 and 1943, but by late 1944, the effect tended to polarize opinion between the hardliners and the war-weary. Berlin had been the city with the highest proportion of opponents to the Nazi regime, as its voting records before 1933 indicate. But with the exception of a very small and courageous minority, opposition to the Nazis had generally been limited to jibes and grumbles. The majority had been genuinely horrified by the assassination attempt against Hitler on the 20th of July 1944. And as the Reich's frontiers became threatened both in the east and in the west, they drank in Goebbels's stream of lies that the Führer would unleash new wonder weapons against their enemies, as if he were about to assume the role of a wrathful Jupiter, flinging thunderbolts as a symbol of his power. A letter written by a wife to her husband in a French prison camp reveals the embattled mentality and the readiness to believe the regime's propaganda. "I have such faith in our destiny," she wrote, "that nothing can shake a confidence which is born from our long history, from our glorious past, as Dr. Goebbels says. It's impossible that things turn out differently. We may have reached a very low point at this moment, but we have men who are decisive. The whole country is ready to march, weapons in hand. We have secret weapons, which will be used at the chosen moment, and we have above all a Führer whom we can follow with our eyes closed. Don't allow yourself to be beaten down. You must not at any price." The Ardennes offensive, launched on the 16th of December 1944, intoxicated Hitler loyalists with revived morale. The tables had at last turned. Belief in the Führer and in the Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons such as the VA, blinded them to reality. Rumours spread that the US First Army had been completely surrounded and taken prisoner due to an anesthetic gas. They thought that they could hold the world to ransom and take revenge for all that Germany had suffered. Veteran NCOs appear to have been among the most embittered. Paris was about to be recaptured, they told each other with fierce glee. Many regretted that the French capital should have been spared from destruction the year before while Berlin was bombed to ruins. They exulted at the idea that history might now be corrected. The German army's high command did not share this enthusiasm for the offensive in the West. General staff officers feared that Hitler's strategic coup against the Americans in the Ardennes would weaken the Eastern Front at a decisive moment. The plan was in any case vastly overambitious. The operation was spearheaded by the 6th SS Panzer Army of Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army of General Hasso von Manteuffel. Yet the lack of fuel made it extremely unlikely that they would ever reach their objective of Antwerp, the Western Allies' main supply base. Hitler was fixated by dreams of dramatically reversing the fortunes of war and forcing Roosevelt and Churchill to come to terms. He had decisively rejected any suggestion of overtures to the Soviet Union. partly for the sound reason that Stalin was interested only in the destruction of Nazi Germany. But there was also a fundamental impediment. Hitler suffered from an atrocious personal vanity. He could not be seen to sue for peace when Germany was losing. A victory in the Ardennes was therefore vital for every reason. But American doggedness in defence, especially at Bastogne, and the massive deployment of Allied air power once the weather cleared, broke the momentum of attack within a week. On Christmas Eve, General Heinz Guderian, the chief of the Army Supreme Command, OKH, drove in his large Mercedes staff car to Führer headquarters in the west. After abandoning the Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia on the 2nd of November 1944, Hitler had moved to Berlin for a minor operation on his throat. He had then left the capital on the evening of the 1st of December in his personal armoured train. His destination was another secret and camouflaged complex in woods near Ziegenberg, less than 40 kilometres from Frankfurt am Main. Designated the Adlerhorst or Eagle's Eyrie, it was the last of his field headquarters to be known by code names which reeked of puerile fantasy. Guderian, the great theorist of tank warfare, had known the dangers of such an operation from the start, but he had little say in the matter. Although the OKH was responsible for the Eastern Front, it was never allowed a free hand. The OKW, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, all the armed forces, was responsible for operations outside the Eastern Front. Both organizations were based just south of Berlin in neighboring underground complexes at Zossen. Despite having as quick a temper as Hitler, Guderian was very different in outlook. He had little time for an entirely speculative international strategy when the country was under attack from both sides. Instead, he relied on a soldier's instinct for the point of maximum danger. There was no doubt where that lay. His briefcase contained the intelligence analysis of General Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Fremde Heere Ost, the military intelligence department for the Eastern Front. Gehlen calculated that around the 12th of January, the Red Army would launch a massive attack from the line of the river Vistula. His department estimated that the enemy had a superiority of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in artillery, and also in aviation. Guderian entered the conference room at the Adlerhorst to find himself facing Hitler and his military staff, and also Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, who, after the July plot, had also been made commander of the replacement army. Every member of Hitler's military staff had been selected for his unquestioning loyalty. Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of staff of the OKW, was famous for his pompous civility to Hitler. Exasperated army officers referred to him either as the Reichsgarage attendant or the nodding donkey. Colonel General Jodl, who had a cold, hard face, was far more competent than Keitel, yet he hardly ever opposed the Führer's disastrous attempts to control every battalion. He had very nearly been dismissed in the autumn of 1942 for having dared to contradict his master. General Burgdorf, Hitler's chief military adjutant and chief of the Army Personnel Department controlling all appointments, had replaced the devoted General Schmundt, mortally wounded by Stauffenberg's bomb at the Wolfschanze. Burgdorf was the man who had delivered the poison to Field Marshal Rommel, with the ultimatum to commit suicide. Using the findings of Gehlen's intelligence department, Guderian outlined the Red Army's build-up for a huge offensive in the east. He warned that the attack would take place within 3 weeks, and requested that since the Ardennes offensive had now ground to a halt, as many divisions as possible should be withdrawn for redeployment on the Vistula front. Hitler stopped him. He declared that such estimates of enemy strength were preposterous. Soviet rifle divisions never had more than 7,000 men each. Their tank corps had hardly any tanks. "It's the greatest imposture since Genghis Khan," he shouted, working himself up. "Who is responsible for producing all this rubbish?" Guderian resisted the temptation to reply that it was Hitler himself who talked of German armies, when they were the size of a single corps, and of infantry divisions reduced to battalion strength. Instead, he defended Gehlen's figures. To his horror, General Jodl argued that the offensive in the west should continue with further attacks. Since this was exactly what Hitler wanted, Guderian was thwarted. It was even more provoking for him to have to listen at dinner to the verdict of Himmler, who revelled in his new role of military leader. He had recently been made Army Group Commander on the Upper Rhine, in addition to his other appointments. "You know, my dear Colonel General," he said to Guderian, "I don't really believe that the Russians will attack at all. It's all an enormous bluff." Guderian had no alternative but to return to OKH headquarters at Zossen. In the meantime, the losses in the west mounted. The Ardennes offensive and its ancillary operations cost 80,000 German casualties. In addition, it had used up a large proportion of Germany's rapidly dwindling fuel reserves. Hitler refused to accept that the Ardennes battle was his equivalent of the Kaiserschlacht, the last great German attack of the First World War. He obsessively rejected any parallels with 1918. For him, 1918 symbolized only the revolutionary stab in the back, which brought down the Kaiser and reduced Germany to a humiliating defeat. Yet Hitler had moments of clarity during those days. "I know the war is lost," he said late one evening to Colonel Nicholas von Below, his Luftwaffe aide. "The enemy's superiority is too great." But he continued to lay all the blame on others for the sequence of disasters. They were all traitors, especially army officers. He suspected that many more had sympathized with the failed assassins, yet they had been pleased enough to accept medals and decorations from him. "We will never surrender," he said. "We may go down, but we will take a world with us." Horrified by the new disaster looming on the Vistula, Guderian returned to the Adlerhorst at Ziegenberg twice more in rapid succession. To make matters worse, he heard that Hitler, without warning him, was transferring SS panzer troops from the Vistula front to Hungary. Hitler, convinced as usual that only he could see the strategic issues, had suddenly decided to launch a counterattack there on the grounds that the oil fields must be retaken. In fact, he wanted to break through to Budapest, which had been surrounded by the Red Army on Christmas Eve. Guderian's visit on New Year's Day coincided with the annual procession of the regime's grandees and the chiefs of staff to transmit in person to the Führer their wishes for a successful new year. That same morning, Operation North Wind, the main subsidiary action to prolong the Ardennes offensive, was launched in Alsace. The day turned out to be a catastrophe for the Luftwaffe. Goering, in a grand gesture of characteristic irresponsibility, committed almost 1,000 planes to attack ground targets on the Western Front. This attempt to impress Hitler led to the final destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective force. It gave the Allies total air supremacy. The Großdeutscher Rundfunk broadcast Hitler's New Year speech that day. No mention was made of the fighting in the West, which suggested failure there, and surprisingly little was said of the Wunderwaffen. A number of people believed that the speech had been pre-recorded or even faked. Hitler had not been seen in public for so long that wild rumours were circulating. Some asserted that he had gone completely mad and that Goering was in a secret prison because he had tried to escape to Sweden. Some Berliners, fearful of what the year would bring, had not quite dared to clink glasses when it came to the toast, Prosit Neujahr. The Goebbels family entertained Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the Stuka ace and the most decorated officer in the Luftwaffe. They sat down to a dinner of potato soup as a symbol of austerity. The New Year holiday ended on the morning of the 3rd of January. The German devotion to work and duty remained unquestioned, however improbable the circumstances. Many had little to do in their offices and factories, owing to shortages of raw materials and parts, but they still set out on foot through the rubble or on public transport. Once again, miracles had been achieved repairing the U-Bahn and the S-Bahn tracks, even though few of the carriages had unbroken windows. Factories and offices were also freezing due to smashed windows and so little fuel for heating. Those with colds or flu had to struggle on. There was no point attempting to see a doctor unless you were seriously ill. Almost all the German doctors had been sent to the army. Local surgeries and hospitals depended almost entirely on foreigners. Even Berlin's main teaching hospital, the Charité, included doctors from over half a dozen countries on its staff, including Dutch, Peruvians, Romanians, Ukrainians, and Hungarians. The only industry which appeared to be flourishing was armaments production. directed by Hitler's personal architect and wunderkind, Albert Speer. On the 13th of January, Speer gave a presentation to Army Corps commanders in the camp at Krampnitz, just outside Berlin. He emphasized the importance of contact between front commanders and the war industries. Speer, unlike other Nazi ministers, did not insult his audience's intelligence. He disdained euphemisms about the situation and did not shrink from mentioning the catastrophic losses sustained by the Wehrmacht over the last 8 months. The Allied bombing campaign was not the problem, he argued. German industry had produced 18,000 rifles in December alone. This was nearly double the average monthly output achieved in 1941, the year the Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union. The manufacture of automatic weapons had risen by nearly 4 times, and tank production nearly 5-fold. In December 1944, they had produced 84 armoured vehicles in a single month, over half what they had made in the whole of 1941. This also included far heavier tanks. The trickiest problem, he warned them, was the shortage of fuel. Surprisingly, he said little of ammunition reserves. There was little point producing all these weapons if munitions production failed to keep pace. Speer spoke for over 40 minutes, reeling off his statistics with quiet professionalism. He did not rub in the fact that it was the massive defeats on the eastern and western fronts over the last 8 months which had reduced the Wehrmacht to such shortages in all types of weapons. He voiced the hope that German factories might reach a production level of 100,000. Machine pistols a month by the spring of 1946. The fact that these enterprises relied largely on slave labourers dragooned by the SS was not, of course, mentioned. Speer also failed to remark upon their wastage, thousands of deaths a day, and the territories from which they came were about to diminish further. At that very moment, Soviet armies numbering over 4 million men were massed in Poland along the River Vistula and just south of the East Prussian border. They were starting the offensive which Hitler had dismissed as an imposture. General Galen's estimates of Soviet strength were certainly not exaggerated. If anything, they were well short of the mark on the threatened sectors. The Red Army had 6.7 million men along a front which stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic. This was over twice the strength of the Wehrmacht and its allies when they invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Hitler's conviction that the Red Army was about to collapse had proved to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in history. "We are lost," a German sergeant acknowledged in January 1945, "but we will fight to the last man." Battle-hardened combatants of the Eastern Front had come to believe that it must all end in death. Any other outcome appeared unthinkable after everything that had gone before. They knew what had been done in the occupied territories and that the Red Army intended to exact revenge. Surrender meant being worked to death in Siberian labor camps as a Standpferd, a Stalin horse. "We no longer fought for Hitler, or for National Socialism, or for the Third Reich," wrote an Alsatian veteran of the Grossdeutschland division, "or even for our fiancés or mothers or families trapped in bomb-ravaged towns. We fought from simple fear. We fought for ourselves, so that we wouldn't die in holes filled with mud and snow. We fought like rats." The disasters of the previous year, above all the encirclement and destruction of Army Group Center, were hard to forget. National Socialist leadership officers, the Nazi imitation of the Soviet Commissar, tried to raise the fighting morale of the ordinary German soldier, the Lanzer, with promises as well as threats of execution for anyone who deserted or retreated without orders. "You do not need to fear the Russian offensive," they told them. "If the enemy start to attack, our tanks will be here in 4 hours." But the more experienced soldiers knew what they were up against. Although Guderian's staff officers at Zossen had formed an accurate idea of the date of attack, the information does not seem to have filtered down to the front line. Corporal Alois K. of the 304th Infantry Division, seized as a tongue by a Soviet raiding party, told intelligence officers of the 1st Ukrainian Front that they had expected an attack before Christmas. Then they were told to expect one on I.O. January, because it was supposed to be Stalin's birthday. On the 9th of January, after an urgent tour of the 3 main eastern fronts, Hungary, the Vistula, and East Prussia General Guderian, accompanied by his aide, Major Baron Freytag von Loringhoven, had again gone to see Hitler at Ziegenberg. He presented the latest estimates of enemy strengths, both Galen's compilation and also those of the Luftwaffe commander, General Seidemann. Air reconnaissance indicated that there were 8,000 Soviet planes concentrated on the Vistula and East Prussian fronts. Goering interrupted the army chief of staff. "Mein Führer, don't believe that," he said to Hitler. "Those are not real planes. Those are just decoys." Keitel, in a sycophantic show of resolution, smashed his fist down on the table. "The Reichsmarschall is right," he declared. The meeting continued as a black farce. Hitler repeated his view that the intelligence figures were completely idiotic and added that the man who compiled them should be locked in a lunatic asylum. Guderian retorted angrily that since he supported them completely, he had better be certified as well. Hitler refused out of hand the requests of General Harp on the Vistula front and General Reinhardt in East Prussia to withdraw their most exposed troops to more defensible positions. He also insisted that the 200,000 German troops trapped on the Courland Peninsula in Latvia should remain there and not be evacuated by sea to defend the Reich's borders. Guderian, disgusted with the ostrich strategy of Führer headquarters, prepared to take his leave. "The Eastern Front," said Hitler, suddenly trying to charm him, "has never before possessed such a strong reserve as now. That is your doing. I thank you for it." "The Eastern Front," Guderian retorted, "is like a house of cards. If the front is broken through at one point, all the rest will collapse." Ironically, Goebbels had used exactly the same simile in 1941 about the Red Army. Guderian returned to Zossen in a very grave mood. He wondered whether Hitler and Jodl's lack of imagination had something to do with the fact that they both came from parts of the Reich, Austria and Bavaria, which were not threatened. Guderian was a Prussian. His homeland was about to be ravaged, and probably lost forever. Hitler, to reward his great panzer leader for his successes early in the war, had presented him with the expropriated estate of Diepenhof in the Warthegau, the region of western Poland which the Nazis had seized and incorporated into the Reich. But now the imminent offensive across the Vistula threatened that too. His wife was still there, watched closely by the local Nazi party chiefs. She would not be able to leave until the very last moment. Just over 24 hours later, Guderian's staff at Zossen received confirmation that the attack was now hours rather than days away. Red Army sappers were clearing minefields at night, and tank corps were being brought forward into the bridgeheads. Hitler ordered that the panzer reserves on the Vistula front should be moved forward, despite warnings that this would bring them within range of Soviet artillery. Some senior officers began to wonder whether Hitler subconsciously wanted to lose the war. The Red Army seemed to make a habit of attacking in atrocious weather conditions. German veterans, accustomed to this pattern, used to call it weather for Russians. Soviet troops were convinced that they had a distinct advantage in winter warfare, whether through frost or mud. Their comparatively low rates of frostbite and trench foot were attributed to the traditional Russian army use of rough linen foot bandages instead of socks. Weather forecasts had foretold a strange winter. After the hard cold of January, heavy rain and wet snow were predicted. An order went out. Leather boots must be mended. The Red Army had improved in so many ways. Its heavy weaponry, the professionalism of its planning, the camouflage and control of operations which had frequently caught the Germans off balance. Yet some weaknesses remained. The worst was the chaotic lack of discipline, which seems astonishing in a totalitarian state. Part of the problem came from the terrible attrition among young officers. It was a hard school indeed for 17- and 18-year-old junior lieutenants in the infantry. At that time, wrote the novelist and war correspondent Konstantin Simonov, young people were becoming adult in a year, a month, or even in the course of one battle. Many, of course, never survived that first battle. Determined to prove themselves worthy of commanding veterans, some of whom were old enough to be their fathers, they showed reckless courage and suffered for it. Indiscipline came also from the dehumanized way in which Red Army soldiers were treated by their own authorities. And of course, the strengths and weaknesses of the complex national character played its part too. The Russian infantryman, as one writer put it, is hardy, undemanding, careless, and a convinced fatalist. It is these characteristics which make him incomparable. An ordinary soldier in a rifle division provided a summary in his diary of the changing moods of his comrades. First state, soldier with no chiefs around. He is a grumbler. He threatens and shows off. He is keen to pocket something or grab someone in a stupid argument. One can see from this irritability that the soldier's life is hard for him. Second state, soldier in the presence of chiefs, submissive and inarticulate, readily agrees with what he is told, easily believes promises, blossoms when praised, and is eager to admire the strictness of officers whom he makes fun of behind their backs. Third state, working together or in battle. Here he is a hero. He won't leave his comrade in danger. He dies quietly, as if it is still part of his work. Tank troops in the Red Army were in particularly good heart. Having been as demoralized as Soviet aviation in the early part of the war, they were starting to enjoy heroic status. Vasily Grossman, another novelist and war correspondent, now found tankists almost as fascinating as he had found snipers at Stalingrad. He described them admiringly as cavalrymen, artillerymen, and mechanics, all rolled in one. But the greatest strength of the Red Army was the burning idea that they were finally within striking distance of the Reich. The violators of the Soviet motherland were about to discover the true meaning of the proverb, "You will harvest what you have sown." The basic concept of the campaign had been decided in outline by the end of October 1944. The Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Headquarters, was headed by Marshal Stalin, as he had promoted himself after the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalin intended to keep full control. He allowed commanders a latitude of action which their German counterparts envied, and unlike Hitler, he would listen carefully to counter-arguments. Nevertheless, he had no intention of allowing Red Army commanders to get above themselves as the moment of victory approached. He stopped the usual practice of appointing representatives of the Stavka to oversee operations. Instead, he took on this role himself, even though he still had no intention of going anywhere near the front. Stalin also decided to shake up the key commands. If this resulted in jealousies and disconcertedness, then he was far from displeased. The main change was to replace Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, the commander-in-chief of the First Belarusian Front, the main group of armies on the axis of advance to Berlin. Rokossovsky, a tall, elegant, and good-looking cavalryman, presented a striking contrast to most Russian commanders, many of whom were squat, thick-necked, and shaven-headed. He was also different in another way. Born Konstanty Rokossovsky, he was half Polish, the grandson and great-grandson of Polish cavalry officers. This made him dangerous in the eyes of Stalin. Stalin's hatred of the country had started during the Soviet-Polish War of 1920, when he had been partly blamed for the disastrous defeat of the Red Army attacking Warsaw. Rokossovsky was outraged when he heard that he was to be transferred to command the 2nd Belarusian Front Army Group to attack East Prussia. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the stocky and immensely tough commander who directed the defense of Moscow in December 1941, was to take his place. "Why this disgrace?" Rokossovsky demanded. "Why am I being moved from the main axis to one of secondary importance?" Rokossovsky suspected that Zhukov, whom he had considered a friend, had undermined him. But in fact, Stalin did not want a Pole to enjoy the glory of taking Berlin. It was natural that Rokossovsky should be suspicious. He had been arrested during the purge of the Red Army in 1937. The beatings from Beria's henchmen demanding confessions of treason were enough to make even the most balanced person slightly paranoid. And Rokossovsky knew that Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD secret police, and Viktor Abakumov, the chief of Smersh counterintelligence, watched him closely. Stalin had left Rokossovsky in no doubt that the 1937 accusations still hung over him. He had simply been released conditionally. Any blunder as a commander would put him straight back into NKVD custody. "I know very well what Beria is capable of," Rokossovsky said to Zhukov during the changeover. "I have been in his prisons." It would take Soviet generals 8 years to get their revenge on Beria. The forces of the East Belarusian Front and the East Ukrainian Front lining up against the German front line along the Vistula, were not simply superior, they were overwhelming. To Zhukov's south, Marshal Konev's ice and Ukrainian front would attack due east towards Breslau. Its main thrust would be launched from the Sandomierz bridgehead, the largest salient of all on the west bank of the Vistula. Unlike Zhukov, however, Konev intended to use his two tank armies to smash the enemy line on the very first day. Konev, according to Beria's son, had wicked little eyes, a shaven head that looked like a pumpkin, and an expression full of self-conceit. He was probably Stalin's favourite general, and one of the very few senior commanders whom even Stalin admired for his ruthlessness. Stalin had promoted him to Marshal of the Soviet Union after his crushing of the Korsun pocket, south of Kiev, just under a year before. It had been one of the most pitiless engagements in a very cruel war. Konev ordered his aircraft to drop incendiaries on the small town of Shandarovka to force the Germans sheltering there out into the blizzard. As they struggled to break out of the encirclement on the 17th of February 1944, Konev sprang his trap. His tank crews charged straight for the column, firing machine guns and running men down to crush them under their tracks. As the Germans scattered, trying to flee through the heavy snow, Konev's 3 divisions of cavalry set off in pursuit. The Cossacks cut them down mercilessly with their sabres, apparently hacking even at arms raised in surrender. Some 20,000 Germans died that day. On the 12th of January, the Vistula offensive began at 5 a.m. Moscow time, when Konev's ice and Ukrainian front attacked out of the Sandomierz bridgehead. The snow was quite heavy and visibility almost nil. After Strafe companies of prisoners were forced through the minefields, rifle battalions secured the front line. The full artillery bombardment then began, using up to 300 guns per kilometre, which meant one every 3 to 4 metres. The German defenders were shattered. Most of them surrendered, grey-faced and trembling. A panzer grenadier officer watching from the rear described the spectacle on the horizon as a firestorm, and added that it was like the heavens falling down on earth. Prisoners from the 16th Panzer Division captured late that day claimed that once the bombardment started, their commander, Major General Miller, drove off towards the town of Kielce, abandoning his men. Soviet tank crews had painted slogans on their turrets: "Forward into the fascist lair," and "Revenge and death to the German occupiers." They faced little resistance as their T-34 and heavy Stalin tanks moved forward at 2 p.m. Their hulls, coated in frost, were well camouflaged for the snowy landscape ahead, even if all was brown in the middle distance from shell-churned mud. Along with Breslau, the main objectives of General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army and General Lelyushenko's 4th Guards Tank Army were the industrial regions of Silesia. When Stalin had briefed Konev in Moscow, he had pointed at the map and circled the area with his finger. He mouthed a single word: gold. No further comment was needed. Konev knew that Stalin wanted the factories and mines to be taken intact. On the morning after Konev's attack from the Sandomierz bridgehead, the assault on East Prussia began with General Chernyakovsky's 3rd Belarusian front. On the following day, the 14th of January, Rokossovsky's forces attacked East Prussia from the River Naro bridgeheads. Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front went into action on its 2 bridgeheads on the Vistula at Magnusiu and Pulawi. A thin layer of snow covered the ground and dense mist lasted until noon. At 8:30 a.m., Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front opened up with 25 minutes of rolling fire. The advanced rifle battalions, supported by self-propelled assault guns, seized the front lines in the Magnusiu bridgehead. The 8th Guards Army and the 5th Shock Army, with heavy artillery support, then broke open the 3rd line. The main barrier beyond was the River Pilika. Zhukov's plan was for rifle divisions to seize crossing places for the Guards tank brigades following on behind. The right-hand tank brigade of Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army was one of the first to cross the Pilika. As a lead unit, the 47th Guards Tank Brigade had a variety of support attached, including sappers, self-propelled artillery, motorized anti-aircraft guns, and a battalion of submachine gunners mounted in trucks. Its objective was an airfield J just south of the town of Sochachiu, an important junction due west of Warsaw. Over the next 2 days, the brigade charged northwards, destroying columns of fleeing Germans on the way and crushing staff cars with their tracks. It took much longer for the Ist Guards tank army on the left to break through. Colonel Gusakovsky, a hero of the Soviet Union twice over, was so impatient after the long wait that when his 44th Guards tank brigade reached the Pilika, he refused to wait for the bridging equipment. It appeared to be a shallow stretch of the river, so to save 2 or 3 hours, he ordered his tank commanders first to smash the ice with gunfire, then to drive their vehicles across the riverbed. The tanks, acting like icebreakers, pushed the broken ice aside with a terrible thundering noise. It must have been terrifying for the tank drivers, but Gusakovsky did not seem concerned by such problems. Zhukov, too, was interested only in getting the tank brigades across so that they could deal with the 25th and the 19th Panzer Divisions. After that, the country lay open ahead. Things had gone just as well for him at the Pulawai bridgehead on the 14th of January. The plan was not to bombard the whole line, but simply to blast corridors through it. By that evening, they were well on the way to the city of Radom. Meanwhile, on the Ice and Belarusian front's extreme right, the 47th Army began to encircle Warsaw from the north, and the East Polish Army fought into the suburbs. In the late afternoon of Monday the 15th of January, because of the big advance in the east, Hitler left the Adlerhorst at Ziegenberg to return to Berlin on his special train. Guderian had been forcefully requesting his return for the last 3 days. At first, Hitler had said that the Eastern Front must sort itself out, but finally he agreed to halt all activity in the west and return. Without consulting Guderian or the 2 army groups involved, he had just issued orders for the Grossdeutschland Corps to be moved from East Prussia to Kielce to shore up the Vistula front, even though this meant taking it out of the battle for at least a week. Hitler's journey by rail to Berlin took 19 hours. He did not entirely neglect domestic matters. He told Martin Bormann to stay at the Obersalzberg for the time being, where he and his wife kept Eva Braun and her sister Gretel Fegelein company. Stalin, meanwhile, was in excellent spirits. That same evening, he welcomed General Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, who had finally arrived in Moscow after long delays in Cairo due to bad flying conditions. Tedder had come to discuss future developments, but Stalin observed smugly that the Ardennes offensive had been very stupid of the Germans. He was also particularly pleased that the Germans had retained 30 divisions as a prestige garrison in Kurland, the remains of Army Group North, which Guderian wanted to bring back to Germany. The Soviet leader made an effort to charm Tedder. He clearly wanted to convince Eisenhower's deputy that he had done everything possible by the timing of the Red Army's great offensive to help them out over the Ardennes. It is impossible to tell whether or not he foresaw that this would help exacerbate the rift between the Americans and the much more sceptical Churchill. Soviet historians always tried to maintain that Stalin was planning to launch the attack on AO January, but then, when he received a letter from Churchill on the 6th of January begging for help, he gave the order the next day to advance the attack to Is January, even though the weather conditions were unfavourable. This was a gross misrepresentation of Churchill's letter. It was not a begging letter to save the Allies in the Ardennes. He had already written to say that the Allies were now masters of the situation, and Stalin knew perfectly well from his liaison officers in the West that the German threat there had collapsed by Christmas. Churchill was simply asking for information on when the Red Army was going to launch its great winter offensive, because the Kremlin had resolutely refused to reply to such requests, even when Soviet liaison officers were kept abreast of Eisenhower's plans. The Vistula offensive, planned since October, had been prepared well ahead. One Soviet source even says that it had been possible to start the advance on 8, the 10th of January. Stalin was therefore more than happy to give the impression that he was saving his allies from a difficult situation, especially when he had reasons of his own for pushing forward the date. Churchill was becoming increasingly concerned at Stalin's intention to impose on Poland its puppet Lublin government made up of exiled Polish communists controlled by Beria's NKVD. The Crimean Conference at Yalta was imminent, and Stalin wanted to make sure that his armies controlled the whole of Poland by the time he sat down with the American and British leaders. His law could be imposed ruthlessly on Polish territory, purely because it constituted the immediate rear area to his operational troops. Anyone who objected could be classified as a saboteur or fascist agent. Finally, there was a much more down-to-earth reason for bringing the Great Offensive forward. Stalin was worried that the predicted change in the weather for the beginning of February would turn hard ground to mud and therefore slow up his tanks. One aspect of the meeting with Tedder is most revealing. Stalin emphasized, the American report states, that one of the difficulties of the Vistula offensive was the large number of trained German agents among the Poles, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Germans speaking Russians. He said that they were all equipped with radios, and, as a result, the element of surprise was practically eliminated. However, the Russians have succeeded in eliminating this menace to a large measure. He said that he considers the clearance of the rear areas to be just as important as bringing up supplies. This gross exaggeration of German-trained stay-behind groups was Stalin's preemptive justification of Soviet ruthlessness in Poland. Beria was also trying to brand the non-communist resistance, the Armia Krajowa, as fascist, despite its suicidal bravery in the Warsaw Uprising. The next 24 hours proved that the Soviet armies, which had broken through the Vistula front, were indeed advancing at full speed. Each seemed to outbid the other. The rapid advances of Zhukov's tank armies were partly due to the simplicity and robust construction of the T-34 tank and its broad tracks, which could cope with snow, ice, and mud. Even so, the mechanics' skills proved at least as important as cavalry dash, because field workshops could not keep up. "Ah, what a life it was before the war," a driver remarked to Grossman. "There were plenty of spare parts then." Once the weather cleared, Sturmovik fighter bombers, known to the Germans as Jarbosses for Jagdbomber, were able to support the headlong advance, as Zhukov had promised his tank commanders. "Our tanks move faster than the trains to Berlin," boasted the ebullient Colonel Gusakovsky, who had blasted his way across the Pilika. The small German garrison in Warsaw did not stand a chance. It consisted of engineer detachments and 4 fortress battalions. One of them was an ear battalion, made up of hearing casualties recycled back into service. The thrust of the 47th Guards Tank Brigade up to Sochachu from the south, and the encirclement of Warsaw from the north by the 47th Army, meant that the garrison lost contact with its parent formation, the 9th Army. General Harp's staff at Army Group A warned OKH in Zossen on the evening of the 16th of January that they would not be able to hold the city. Colonel Bogislaw von Bonin, the head of the operations department, discussed the situation with Guderian. They decided to give Army Group headquarters a free hand in the decision, and Guderian signed the signals log with his usual G in green ink. But in the Nachtlager, Hitler's midnight situation conference, the proposal to abandon Warsaw was reported to Hitler by one of his own staff before Guderian's deputy, General Walter Wenck, brought the subject up. Hitler exploded. "You must stop everything," he shouted. "Fortress Warsaw must be held." But it was already too late, and radio communications had broken down. A few days later, Hitler issued an order that every instruction sent to an army group had to be submitted to him first. The fall of Warsaw led to another bitter row between Hitler and Guderian, who were still arguing over Hitler's decision to move the Grossdeutschland Corps. Guderian was even more furious to hear that Hitler was transferring the 6th SS Panzer Army not to the Vistula front, but to Hungary. Hitler, however, refused to discuss it. The withdrawal from Warsaw was, in his eyes, a far more burning issue. At the noon conference next day, the 18th of January, Guderian was given a public dressing down, but worse was to follow. That evening, recounted Colonel Baron von Humboldt of the OKH staff, it was Bonin's birthday. We were all standing round the map table with a glass of sekt to congratulate him, when General Meisel, the second in command of the personnel department, arrived with 2 Oberleutnants armed with machine pistols. "Herr von Bonin," he said, "I must ask you to come with me." 2 others were arrested with Bonin, Lieutenant Colonel von Christen and Lieutenant Colonel von dem Knesebeck. They were taken off to the Prince Albrechtstrasse on Hitler's direct orders to be interrogated by the Gestapo. Hitler saw the incident as yet another act of betrayal by the army. As well as sacking General Harp, he also removed General von Luttwitz from command of the 9th Army. But the truth was that his monstrous vanity could not allow him to lose a foreign capital, even one which he had totally destroyed. Guderian stood up for his 3 staff officers, insisting that he be interrogated too, since the responsibility for the decision was entirely his. Hitler, longing to indict the General Staff, took him at his word. At this most critical stage of the Vistula campaign, Guderian was subjected to hours of interrogation by Ernst Kaltenbrunner of the Reich Security Head Office and Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo. The 2 more junior officers were released after 2 weeks, but Bonin remained in a concentration camp until the end of the war. The day after Bonin's arrest, Martin Bormann reached Berlin. The next day, Saturday the 20th of January, he recorded in his diary, "The situation in the east is becoming more and more threatening. We are abandoning the region of Worthegau. The leading tank units of the enemy are approaching Katowice." It was the day that Soviet forces crossed the Reich border east of Hohensalza. Guderian's wife abandoned Schloss Diepenhof half an hour before the first shells began to fall. The Chief of Staff wrote that the estate workers, they were probably resettled Baltic Germans, stood in tears beside her car, and many would willingly have accompanied her. Although there can be little doubt about their desperation to leave, this may not have been due entirely to loyalty to their chatelaine. Rumours of what was happening in East Prussia had already started to circulate. Soldiers of the Red Army, and its Polish formations especially, were unlikely to feel any more merciful after what they had witnessed in the Polish capital. "We saw the destruction of Warsaw when we entered its empty streets on that memorable day, the 17th of January 1945, wrote Captain Klochkov of the 3rd Shock Army. Nothing was left but ruins and ashes covered by snow. Badly starved and exhausted residents were making their way home. Only 12,000 remained out of a pre-war population of 1,310,000. After the unbelievably brutal suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in October 1944, the Germans had systematically destroyed all the historic monuments of the city, even though none had been used by the rebels. Vasily Grossman made his way through the ruined city to the ghetto. All that remained were the 3.5-metre-high wall, topped with broken glass and barbed wire, and the Judenrat, the Jewish administrative building. The rest of the ghetto was a single undulating red sea of broken bricks. Grossman wondered how many thousands of bodies were buried underneath. It was hard to imagine anyone escaping, but a pole led him to where 4 Jews had just emerged from their hiding place high above the girders of a tall skeleton of a building.